Alrighty, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm super excited to kind of have this conversation with you. Sorry, I'm a little tall. Let's see if we can adjust that. There we go. My name is Cortez Frazier Jr. I have many previous lives. I'm currently a principal product manager. Prior to serving as a principal product manager for FOSSA, I operated as a cybersecurity architect. I work for a company called G Power. They've gone through a lot of name changes. Now I think they're G Vernova or something of that nature. But kind of operated probably in similar roles as a lot of you in this audience. Had about 1,800 1,800 developers underneath my purview, 600 applications, only about three of us on the team. So trying to do a lot with a little. Very transparently here, I am a man of strong opinions, and so I apologize in advance if I ruffle any feathers today. I look forward to having like a really vigorous conversation, challenge my opinions, because I can assure you I will challenge yours. And so with that said, just a little bit of background about FOSSA itself. FOSSA is a kind of comprehensive SBOM lifecycle management company. We got our start in the license compliance space doing SCA, software composition analysis. We also do a variety of things in the binary composition analysis space, snippet detection, and then tools as well. Um, what that has afforded me is an opportunity to work with a lot of different companies who are in various aspects of their SBOM maturity, if you will. Kind of, going about 3 years now into my SBOM journey, and I'm absolutely excited about seeing the progress of taking this really theoretical concept that we've now turned into real world applications. And I want to kind of talk through three. I think one of them, most of you all will be familiar with. That's kind of the bread and butter on the generation and distribution use case. And there's two other ones that hopefully will be a bit newer to you and you kind of take some things away. Kind of before I jump in, at this point in time, I think we should probably be in a good space, but I just want to see how much introductory information I need to provide today. Just show of hands, how many people have heard of an SBOM at this point in time? Fantastic. Everybody in the room, that's what I like to see. 2 years ago, that was not the case, so we're making progress. What about concepts like VEX, Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, and VDR, Vulnerability Disclosure Report? We familiar with these things? Excellent, fantastic. And then what about some concepts around like package URL, CPE, Omnivore ID? We've heard of some of these things? Okay, cool. So that one's a little bit more mixed. I'll spend a little bit of time there, but it seems like we all have a decent basic understanding. I'll probably go through the kind of like SBOM landscape pretty quickly. Then it seems like we have some decent SBOM experts in the audience, which I'm excited about, and then try to spend the vast majority of my time on those three individual scenarios, some challenges that I think each one will experience, and then an ideal workflow based on my experience with various customers. Okay, perfect. First and foremost, let's kind of walk through the SBOM landscape. As most things in life, we are not all just excited to open up our doors and tell everyone who will listen what our package ecosystem looks like. This is oftentimes driven by outside influences. In our case, that's going to be regulatory environments. Many of you, I'm sure, remember, I think SolarWinds really kind of kicked it off way back when with that software supply chain attack. We all decided, you know what, we cannot continue to operate in darkness as it pertains to what our which other people within our supply chain are bringing into our software organizations. Something that a lot of people don't remember is that the SolarWinds attack actually happened to a developer environment. And so oftentimes we put so much emphasis on purely production code that we forget that there's really many attack surfaces that you have to be mindful of and make sure that you're tracking. In the last 12 to 18 months, the SBOM regulation has been absolutely heating up. I've heard nothing but like CRA all over the conference this week, which has been fantastic. So it seems like a lot of people are at least hearing a lot of this, starting to deal with a lot of this, and want to pass it down. If you do anything on the finance side, PCI 4.0 DSS, interesting because what you'll see commonly in the regulation is they tend to shy away from using the term SBOM directly. They'll use obfuscated words like a inventory of bespoke assets, which we will colloquially call an SBOM moving forward. The FDA requirements as well have been really interesting, in particular, anyone on the medical device manufacturer space who has to do pre-market submissions, post-market submissions, 501ks, and all that kind of good stuff. And then the automotive industry is actually seeing a lot of attraction as of late. UNR 155 was the big one. And once again, does not call out SBOMs explicitly, but it continues to call out this inventory of bespoke assets, just the greatest vehicle for you to be able to communicate some of these things. We have a lot of customers in the automotive space. We're seeing a lot of their tier 1, tier 2 suppliers now being required to provide them SBOMs, and I will talk through that scenario here a bit more. Um, we all know what SBOMs are, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. You got SPDX and Cyclone DX. Those are the big standards. I have a preference, Cyclone DX. I told you I have strong opinions here. But if you're using SPDX, I have no qualms against that. There's lots of reasons why I think Cyclone DX is the better standard, and you're wrong, but that's okay. And I will be happy to debate that with you whenever you're ready. Just kind of, if you've never seen an SBOM before, most people have. It's what it kind of looks like. At the end of the day, an SBOM could be an Excel sheet. If you really wanted it to, you should use JSON, but you can use any format that you desire. I'll spend a little bit of time on VEX and VDR. Oftentimes people confuse the vulnerability disclosure report as a VEX statement in and of itself. And these are actually two separate things. One of them is, how do I disclose what vulnerabilities actually exist in my particular SBOM? The second is then, how do I make an assertion on the exploitability, or if I'm impacted or affected by that particular vulnerability? And so that first being the VDR, show me everything that you have. The next being a VEX, tell me what your status is. There's a lot of unclear questions that I think we still need to answer as an industry on what VEX should truly be, right? Is this a historical never-ending report of every single time you release a new version, you now have to make sure that you audit log any vulnerability that at one point in time has ever impacted your code base? Is it supposed to be a snapshot of that particular point in time of only the vulnerabilities that are currently impacting and their assertion on that status? I think that's a valid open question. I don't think anybody has a great answer for it yet. Once again, I have strong opinions. I think you should make the historical audit trail approach. I think it's better for completeness, and more importantly, allows for you to get ahead of anyone who is consuming your SBOM, which is the primary value proposition of something like a VEX or VDR statement, which is, I do not want to get harassed by my customers, and so I will preemptively give this some information, so that way when they import that into any tool, dependency track, FOSSA, whatever it has, they're going to see 1,000 vulnerabilities and they're going to say, oh my God, your code is absolutely horrible. What's happening here? And this allows for you to get ahead of that conversation. A little bit on the VDR side, what that looks like. Oftentimes people call VEX, and I apologize, I know the gradient's probably not the easiest for you to see. VDR, naming things like the severity, references, what's the CVSS score is, what the attack vectors are. That is all purely on the disclosure side. VEX is this really tiny statement. And I'm oversimplifying here. There's multiple VEX formats. This one is specifically embedded within Cyclone DX. You've probably seen VEX in the form of CSAF and OpenVEX as well. Those are totally fine formats. I think those ones are really exciting. I would actually probably encourage you to have VEX as a standalone document rather than directly embedded in the SBOM where possible, primarily because new vulnerabilities are going to continue to come out whether you change your code base or not. And so even though an SBOM is static, the assessment around it oftentimes is very dynamic, and particularly on the vulnerability and support status side. And so I do think this is a really important takeaway that oftentimes people really get this confused. Literally just these two lines here. What is my state? Am I affected, not affected, under investigation, or has it been fixed? And then what's the justification and detail information surrounding that? Is sufficient enough in its most basic form to satisfy a VEX statement for you. Okay. We burned through our kind of SBOM 101. Let's kind of hop into some of these scenarios and see kind of what you're experiencing, what I'm seeing out there in the landscape. I'm going to start with the easiest one, and you'll notice that these scenarios actually build upon each other. And so if you have not reached scenario 1, it's going to be really difficult for you to get to 2 and 3. And so this is where I would say 80+% of the industry is at right now, which is purely, can I analyze my source code in whatever means that I want, right? Whether that's with some type of automated tooling, whether I would like to do, run it through ChatGPT and have it come up with the best answer for me, or I would like to use some of the build systems themselves. Either way, it doesn't matter how you get it. Being able to generate that SBOM and distribute that on a regular basis is the first place that you want to start, and being able to do so on a per build, per commit, per deployment, per release cycle start to become extremely important. We've already surfaced some motivations of where this is kind of coming from. I think the regulation is a big one. Another one, though, that people don't talk about enough is this this, I am an indirect customer of a government contractor, right? And so I don't do direct business with any government entities, but my customers do. And thus I now have to be able to matriculate anything that they're using up to that level so they can kind of put it together and use what you'll hear me refer to as application level SBOMs. Oftentimes you're taking your first party code, combining it with some type of third party binary or other kind of final artifact, and then you need to be able to represent that. We see this in particular in the automotive space. I have an infotainment system. The infotainment system has a bunch of SDKs and binaries coming from other suppliers because they control ECUs and other parts of the car, or they have some intelligence around braking and things of that nature. And so you want to make sure that you can kind of put that final artifact together. Of course, the most valuable aspect, in my opinion, is purely just giving you insight into your software supply chain, both on the infrastructure side, but then oftentimes we spend most of the conversation on vulnerabilities. There's even license compliance implications that can have security impacts if you're then forced to disclose your source code and you're not prepared for that influx of targeted attacks. Let's kind of talk through some of these like technical challenges before I get into the workflow itself that I think you'll run into purely just trying to generate an SBOM. One of the big ones is oftentimes our code bases are very, very diverse. And so you'll see this kind of polyglot tooling that is necessary in order to kind of scan it. Very rarely will you be able to find just absolutely one tool that can scan absolutely everything. And so you have to figure out within your tech stack what is going to give you the most accurate list of components. Most importantly, how are you going to get those full relationships? Oftentimes you see people scope to just direct dependencies and SBOMs. That's terrible. Do not do that. You need to have the full dependency graph, including transitive dependencies, as well as some ability to label and scope those dependencies so you have context on are they statically linked versus dynamically linked. That has wildly different implications for you. Are these dev and test dependencies or these production dependencies? And so being able to assert some of these different scopes is going to be incredibly powerful for you. Another really big challenge that you'll see is, in particular, if you operate in, say, like embedded systems or deployed systems, is how do I actually have an accurate SBOM when there's no central package manager, right? If I'm using Yocto or Buildroot, I can literally point to, zip files locally within my code base. How do I represent that in a way that someone else can consume and being able to recognize? There's some unique identifiers such as Omnivore ID that are starting to come up that I think are getting closer to be able to do so. You'll see me advocate for Perl very often, but even Perl has its own challenges. You'll never hear me advocate for CPE. It's absolutely god awful. Do not use it in any way, shape, or form if you can avoid it. However, there are some scenarios where you have no choice, and thus I digress. Before I kind of hop into the workflow itself, something that is oftentimes forgotten about as you think about your risk management program is support status, right? Are your packages being actively maintained by the open source maintainer? Have they been abandoned? And this is actually a tricky one, in particular in the open source space, because there's oftentimes not a central repository for this. I know there's a few people, I think I ran into the BumpGen or XOL group, and they're starting to put a database together for that. You have things like endoflife.date and OpenEOX, like we're starting to get some traction there. But oftentimes the open source maintainer may not have updated a package purely because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Like everything is operating just fine. And you have to be able to adjust and accommodate for those. All right, this is where I'll probably spend the bulk of my time on each scenario. So I really want to kind of talk through this kind of workflow diagram, if you will. And then it's very important to kind of rock this initial one because all the other scenarios are going to build on top of that. Very, very easy workflow though. I believe in all of you. So we're going to start with our source code. You're going to do some stuff from a development perspective. You're going to add some new functionality. You're going to find some incredible package that makes your life easier. You're going to go ahead and integrate that. At that point in time, you'll submit your PR and you're going to scan that against something, right? Whether you have internal tooling, commercial tooling, homegrown tooling, whatever it is, whatever your personal flavor, and start to surface vulnerabilities and licenses based on that. Now, the question is, when you review those, what is your assessment? Oftentimes, as we know, I think it was like 27,000 CVEs came out last year, 33,000 or so I think we're on pace for this year. Just because a CVE exists on a particular package does not mean it's vulnerable in the specific way that you're using it. And so you have to do that assessment on these vulnerabilities. You have to do the same thing on the license license compliance side, which is if I have copyleft code that is LGPL licensed, but I am dynamically linking that as compared to statically linking, now all of a sudden these source disclosure requirements are no longer required. And that begins to free you up. And so going back to that conversation around making sure that you have accurate package labels and scopes associated becomes really, really critical kind of inside of this workflow. As you're going through and reviewing these vulnerabilities, that's when you'll start to create your VEX and VDR assertions. So that way you can then proactively start to get ahead of whoever is going to consume these vulnerabilities and ensure that you don't have any problems there. You're going to merge and deploy that build and then generate your SBOM. And now for most people, they think that you can stop there, which for a very basic and simple application, yes, you probably can. I would imagine most of us in this room have much more complex development environments than that. And so between multi-stage builds, between having massive monorepos, between having, very complicated architectures, you're probably going to have to put together what I oftentimes refer to as this application level SBOM. And so do I have additional repos and projects that I need to have coverage for? If so, then I will rinse and repeat, right? And continue to kind of go through that particular process. Once I now have every single one of my repositories scanned, I've assessed the vulnerabilities, I've assessed the license risks, I've made VEX assertions on that. I want to make sure that I'm pinning that particular commit or release. And that way I can continuously monitor that on a regular basis and be able to go back to that. In particular, if you're maintaining multiple versions or if you have an on-prem and SaaS deployment for similar situations, making sure that you have the ability to pin particular releases is one that I very rarely see people put a lot of emphasis on, but will cripple your SBOM program if you do not have that capability. Lastly, you get to deploy to production, and then everything is kind of nirvana at that point, and you're kind of off to the races. And so this is kind of your initial workflow. If you're looking to generate SBOMs on a regular basis, ideally, this could be a three-step process. You could submit your PR, you can get vulns, your developers can assess them, and then everything else should be automated on the back half of that. I'm happy to kind of talk through more strategies on how to get there during the Q&A portion. All right. A couple of just like best practices if you're going to take this approach. How you choose to distribute your SBOM is very, very important. As I mentioned earlier, the SBOM itself is static. Analysis around that is very dynamic. And so having a process on each build, on each deployment, on each release that you're reviewing, that you can publicly share that in some way, whether that's a homegrown tooling or you're using something commercial, is going to be critical for you. This is an example of the CNCF portal where they're sharing SBOMs for CNCF projects like Kubernetes and things of that nature that you can go review publicly if you'd like to take a look at what some other organizations are doing. Red Hat also has a phenomenal portal around SBOM, so I would definitely check them out as well. Alrighty. That is scenario one. I want to hop into scenario two now that we have kind of an understanding of what you would do from a baseline SBOM generation perspective. This is a unique one that I haven't seen a ton of organizations do, but the ones that I have seen operate in this way have been highly effective. Splunk and US Bank are the immediate ones that come in mind, which is to say, oftentimes I do not have direct access to the source code across my entire organization. I very distinctly remember working at GE Power, being a cybersecurity architect, and not having the ability to access all of my GitHub repositories throughout my entire organization made no sense to me whatsoever as the security professional. But at the end of the day, you have to have separation of duties and all kinds of other regulations that tend to limit your access for a God account, if you will. And so if you don't have direct source code access, you have a few options. You can either wrangle your development teams, try to go CI pipeline by CI pipeline to get them fully integrated and spend the next 3 years trying to get coverage across your organization, or you can give them an SBOM spec to follow and say, at the end of the day, I don't care how you do it. I don't care what tooling you use for it. Here's the minimum requirements that I will need in an SBOM, and I need you to generate one per build. And then you can then centralize that information, whether you have source code access. Now, why do you want to centralize vulnerability management? Oftentimes, we are competing with the fact that you got to deliver product, right? You got to deploy shit because you're trying to make money. And so at the end of the day, vulnerability management is an adjacent function to what you're looking to do that is probably not a monetary function for you all. And so when you're then trying to make enterprise-wide decisions on similar tech stacks, because let's be honest, most of our development teams are just using a boilerplate version of the same tech stack that's available in 100 other teams throughout that organization. And so you start to have these opportunities where you can get some real synergies on planning your remediation efforts. A kind of guiding tagline that I want you to think about for this scenario too is, how do I have the greatest overall reduction in my security posture with the least amount of refactor effort? And that least amount of refactor effort is important, because if you have to do a complete refactor in order to remediate one vulnerability, that was poor prioritization on your part. And you should be trying to get the biggest bang for your buck based on that. And how do you do that without having insight, right? And so that's kind of where we'll begin to start. How many people have heard of SSVC, the stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization? Great, great. Man, this is a very educated group. I'm loving this. SSVC is interesting. Very transparently, way too complicated, like absolutely way too complicated from my perspective on a decision-making perspective, but it is fantastic in its theory, which is I need to be able to make a determination on, for a particular vulnerability, do I drop everything and fix it now? Do I plan for that next quarter? Or can I just put this into my normal, kind of sprintly planning cycle? You'll see my workflow here in a bit. I've taken an attempt at trying to, for lack of a better term, reduce the complexity and what I would say is kind of a custom iteration of SSVC. I encourage every organization to build your own decision tree as you decide where drop immediate vulnerability versus one that can be planned for, as we all try to meet this goal of risk reduction rather than risk elimination. Continue my trend. I'm sorry. As I said, I'm a person of strong opinions. Pearl's 1,000 times better than CPE. Don't at me. I seriously, because my biggest frustration on the CPE side, I'll go on a small tangent, is that CPEs are not created until a vulnerability exists on a package. That inherently makes it impossible to uniquely identify a package based on that. Oftentimes, vulnerabilities haven't been found yet for net new packages. Oftentimes, an organization creates a CPE, and that is not the same CPE that MITRE will create when a vulnerability now exists. And so you have a lot of tooling that is hallucinating CPEs that are now wildly inaccurate. And so instead of trying to uniquely identify vulnerabilities, you should try to uniquely identify the asset. And that's what makes Perl a far better standard, because it gives you a specific namespace for a specific package for a specific version. I got a question for the audience, because I'm in this deep now and I must know. If I have glibc 1.3 and that's a Debian package, and I have glibc 1.3 and that's a CentOS package, are those the same packages? Yes, that's the great answer. They are not the same package. And oftentimes people will assume that they are the same, that their vulnerabilities can be the same, and that their licenses can be the same. And yes, sometimes they are, but oftentimes they can be dramatically different. And so that is where this distinction, or this ability to be able to uniquely identify a particular package, becomes wildly important. Some other challenges you're going to run into is, like, how do you play between spec to cycling the SPDX is valid though. You have to be able to do a little bit of mental gymnastics to be able to convert from, manufacturer to supplier to originator. And I know there's like Protobomb and some other tooling out there that will allow for you. And lastly, you have to have consistency on when in your SDLC you're actually building these SBOMs. Lots of open debate when is the most accurate place to be able to generate an SBOM. You can do that at source. You can do that at build time. You can do that right before you deploy. You can do that at runtime. I would advocate for you doing that at build time. I think that's when you're going to get the most accurate dependency graph. The challenge with runtime, which would probably be the better aspect, is it becomes really difficult to then relate relationships when you're only doing scanning at runtime, because you tend to lose the context of those relationships, and you don't want to be forced in a situation where you're evaluating a vulnerability that is 10 layers deep from a transitive perspective. And in order to actually remediate that, you have to fix 4 different direct dependencies. I won't go into the diamond dependency problem with you all right now, but you seem like a smart group, so I'm sure you'll be able to look it up in your free time. All right, let's talk about our workflow then. which is now we've switched from a pure generation workflow to I now want to be able to take this SSVC style approach to making vulnerability assertions or vulnerability groupings on my refactor efforts. And so you're going to see that I'm starting at this application level SBOM. So everything that we've already gone over in scenario one has to have occurred before you can kind of reach this point in your SBOM maturity, if you will. And I'll take a pause for a second and say that where this came from is we were seeing these massive organizations that might have 300,000 or 400,000 vulnerabilities. Every single team was out of SLA because they were on, Spring Boot 4 for whatever reason, and it was complete refactor effort for them to remediate absolutely anything. And so you then are in this position where your choices are to just allow for all this risk to continue on, or you have to make a, kind of a shot in the dark and guess and say, you know what, well, Jackson Databond has the most vulnerability, so I'll just fix that one thing because that makes me feel warm and fuzzy on the inside. Instead, I would prefer for you to take an approach where you can actually group fixes and vulnerabilities together, and then you start to work your way back into what is going to be the least path of resistance, for your greatest vulnerability effort. So we've now generated that SBOM at the application level. You're going to import that into your tooling of choice. Once again, there's kinds of free options like dependency track. Of course, there's some other options that I can advocate for you as well. From there, you want to then make sure that you have those unique identifiers. With something like a Perl, you'll then be able to do a lookup on both licenses and vulnerabilities, and you don't have to worry about trying to ingest a VEX or VDR statement directly and have that be your source of truth. That's now when you start to get into some fun decision making, right? And so first kind of question up there is how critical is this application for me, right? Is this a crown jewel application? Is this externally facing? Is this an internal development tool? If it's an internal development tool, then you might want to immediately start to put that in your quarterly planning process, and you're already going to have SLAs in place to be able to deal with that. Assuming that this is some type of critical application for you, that then moves into your next step, which is this vulnerable or exploitable in the context that I'm using? And that is oftentimes a very expensive question to answer very transparently. And so you can approximate it with some data sources if you would like. You'll see, obviously, our good friend Jay Jacobs is, shouting EPSS from the rooftops, which I'm a massive fan of as well. You can use things like EPSS thresholds to be able to assert a probability on exploitability if you don't necessarily have the engineering time and effort to be able to specifically confirm whether you're exploited with that or not. There's all kinds of other, data sources as well, like Bone Check that has, the MVD++ and some other things that you can use to kind of approximate exploitability at scale. Moving on from that, after you've made a determination on whether it's going to be or not in the particular context that you're using, you have to determine, is there an immediate fix for that particular vulnerability? And if there is an immediate fix, does that fix introduce more vulns? And that one is critical, very transparently, because oftentimes I will see customers go through this kind of whack-a-mole style effort of where you'll be on one particular vulnerable version, you'll upgrade that package that then introduce 3 more critical vulnerabilities to you, and you're in this never-ending cycle. And going back to my original goal, my original assessment, which is how do I have the greatest vulnerability impact with the least amount of refactor effort, the only way you're going to determine that is by having both insight into what vulns are introduced with an upgrade, as well as which ones are going to go away. And then you kind of just repeat that cycle, right? If that immediate fix introduces more vulns, great. No, I have to then go to the next one. Once I go to that next one, I can now do an assessment on what vulnerabilities are being introduced there. This sounds like a really difficult manual process. There's a ton of tooling that will do this automatically for you. And any good vulnerability tooling will take into their fix recommendations, whether that is increasing or decreasing your security posture, kind of based on that. After you've worked your way through this particular loop, if you will, you then determine, okay, great, I'm not introducing any more worse vulnerabilities. Am I now starting to get, some BOGO deals on my remediation, right? Do I remediate other vulnerabilities as a part of that? Yes, you finally do. Fantastic. And then lastly, the most important question is, does this introduce a breaking change, right? If it does introduce a breaking change, you're going to have to do a much more quarterly, I'm sorry, you're going to have to do either a sprintly or quarterly planning process for that. If it does not, you have 100% met your happy path. You should remediate that immediately, do your package version bump, and then go about your life. If not, you kind of continue to go back through the cycle, and you do this for each vulnerability. Perfect. And that is that kind of scenario two, workflow in a nutshell. I want to kind of call how this grouping can actually be done on an automated basis, so that way you're not worrying about doing this yourself. You can see things like quick wins, which are going to be easy patch upgrades, don't require any refactors, groups the vulnerabilities together for you. You also see some assertions on things like high priority vulnerabilities. How are you determining that, right? Over cert EPSS thresholds. Is there reachability information, meaning you've actually confirmed that you're using a vulnerable function via static analysis? Is it on the CSA Kev list? Is there a known exploit on exploit DB? Lots of these factors can go into how you choose to fine tune and pull on different levers to determine a high priority fix for you. But more importantly, what other vulnerabilities do I get for free by making this change? Because at the end of the day, if you're going from 3.0 to 5.0, I can assure you that's going to be a pretty decent refactor. And so you might as well get the largest bang for your buck on that particular one when you're doing your quarterly planning cycle. So. All right. I think I'm doing decently on time, which is absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to get into what is my personal favorite scenario, which is kind of enforcing SBOM standards on external suppliers. I actually truly strongly believe that this is what SBOMs were always meant to do. I imagine this future, we're not there yet, but I imagine this future where every organization has no problems publicly sharing SBOMs. They need to do so privately. I will go into more strong opinions on why I think some concerns there are completely overblown. But ultimately, if I could be in a position where I could force Apple to give me an SBOM, I would. I don't think we're there yet, but that is the future that we're marching towards. Um, as we continue with many of our scenarios, kind of talk about some motivations. What do we think is kind of driving this direction? I think that software supply chain transparency is the cheesy statement. I think in reality, trust but verify is kind of the common theme in all aspects of security. And so while you want to believe in all your heart and wishes and dreams that your suppliers are doing right by you from a vulnerability and license compliance perspective, you have to be able to validate that. And the more transparent that we are across the industry, the better our security posture will be across the industry as well. Um, I also think it's important to call out both support status, but other unknown risks as well. And so things like dependency confusion or typo squatting, you'd be surprised how many third-party supply chain attacks occur, not because of bad code in your first-party code, but because of a dependency confusion attack that is happening on a code that you're bringing in from, say, like a supplier's binary or something of that nature. Now, let's talk about the technical challenges. I actually want to spend a lot of time here because this is the one that I continue to see the most pushback from an industry perspective, which is absolutely not, Cortez. I don't want to share my SBOMs. Why would I want to do that? I'm giving threat actors a blueprint for them to be able to tell exactly what they need to attack to, kind of hack my code base. I'm giving away my IP. And so you want me to just give away all this intellectual property, this moat that I've built up over the course of, how many decades? I'm going to call complete bullshit on both of those very transparently. Let's deal with the first one, intellectual property. I can assure you that if I can reverse engineer your application by simply knowing what packages, whether that's commercial or open source, that you are using, you have a terrible application, absolutely horrendous. And if that is your only moat, I can assure you have bigger problems as an industry. Can I have insight into some of the commercial tooling that you're using? Absolutely. But in any modern organization, the way that you're using these packages, the data that you're generating from your customers and how you're then surfacing that and curating that, that is your intellectual property. Your uses of glibc is not intellectual property, I can assure you. We're all using jQuery, right? The second one that I think is a massive, like, kind of common misunderstanding that if you don't take anything else from my talk today, I want you to go back and champion this in your organizations, which is very rarely, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but very rarely do threat actors truly do targeted attacks, meaning they're not going to go look up your SBOM and say, okay, great. I know that jQuery is vulnerable with this RCE, so I know absolutely how I can go ahead and penetrate this organization. Threat actors tend to take very, very broad attacks. They're going to use absolutely every known exploitable vulnerability that is out there at that moment, and they're going to try to hit every single one at the exact same time. And so your SBOM has not given any competitive advantage in any way, shape, or form to a threat actor from a vulnerability perspective. And I will challenge anyone who believes that that is actually the case. I'd love to have that conversation. now that I've kind of, pushed back on, I think, where some of the kind of big misconceptions around why people are hesitant to want to provide SBOMs. If you're a supplier and either you're OEM or you have a tier two supplier and you're both supplier and OEM and need to be able to matriculate that down, there are some things that you have to be really, really mindful of. I will keep saying it all day, every day, which is unique identifiers are king in the SBOM space, and having accurate component identifiers from a Perl perspective is going to be critical for you. And then most importantly, making sure you have accurate scopes as well from a labeling perspective. So understanding whether these are production dev tests, understanding if these are statically linked or dynamically linked, understanding if these are actively supported or not actively supported, that's going to be the information that allows for you as an SBOM consumer to actually then make useful decisions with this. Alrighty, let's hop into the workflow on this one. I think this is actually going to be one of the easier workflows. We've already done a lot of the upfront work. We've built our application level SBOM. We've generated that and distributed it on a regular basis. We're already ingesting that in some part of the organization as a part of a workflow. And so we're going to kind of pick up there to a certain extent, right? Which is I am a tier one supplier. I, work in the automotive space. I have to provide one of the big, 3 automotive manufacturers an SBOM. How do I do that? All right. So I've already done the work of going through all my individual repositories. I've curated together this application level SBOM. I'm going to then go ahead and share that to the OEM. That OEM is going to import that SBOM into whatever their tooling of choice is, and they're going to want to check it for 2 things. They're going to check it for structural issues from an SBOM perspective, meaning is it of the right spec that I assume, because I prefer Cyclone DX, so it should be Cyclone DX, or is it SPDX, right? Does it have information like the NTIA minimum elements, supplier information? Does it have complete relationships? That one is oftentimes missed. And so putting a lot of emphasis there. Does it have VEX and VDR assertions for any vulnerabilities that are detected, right? So this is all kind of in that structural aspects of it. And then from there, once you have the unique identifiers, you then want to run these SBOMs through the exact same license compliance and vulnerability workflow that you use internally. And so you then say, okay, great, of the vulnerabilities that we detected, how many of these violate our SLA or policies? Are they critical high vulnerabilities, or are these just mediums and lows? And so for whatever reason, I'm comfortable with that. Do I have an EPSS-based workflow, which I would highly recommend moving towards over a CVSS-based workflow, and then use thresholds there. If I do have a vulnerability that is violating, say it's a critical vulnerability that's on the CISA KEV, and so we have an SLA to remediate that in 30 days. I can then look, great, this vulnerability exists. Is there a VEX assertion for this? Maybe this supplier has already told me that they're not affected by this vulnerability, or they fixed it, or they plan to fix it. And here's a customer service, I'm sorry, a customer security advisory that I can then review, which a bunch of information about that. After I've kind of made that determination, yes, great, I can kind of move on to the next vulnerability. No, then I need that supplier to go back to the drawing board. And I need to have an ability to have a two-way communication with my supplier of, here's the things that we surface, both from a content and a structural perspective, and here's the time frame by which that I need you to fix them on. Something I'll pause here for a second, which is if you have proper unique identifiers like Perl, you can actually fill in the gaps on your supplier's behalf, which is really, really powerful. And so if they don't have, supplier information, but that's required because you need it for an FDA submission, or they don't have manufacturer information and that's required because you need that for an FDA submission, then use your unique identifiers to enrich that data on their behalf, and make sure you're spending the bulk of your time on ensuring that they're not violating your open source policies, whereas where you're going to get your largest return. After you kind of work your way through that cycle, the piece that most people forget is that new vulnerabilities come out every day. And so you have to have some type of cycle, some type of process to have back and forth with your suppliers on when a new vulnerability comes out on the exact same SBOM. No new packages have been introduced. How are you going to give me an updated VEX statement on that so I can determine if I'm impacted by it, or if you're going to go ahead and plan to remediate that vulnerability, and on what time frame? Finally, you've done all the hard work. You've made it through. You've generated your SBOM. You've imported it. Your suppliers are, tired of being harassed by you, so they gave you accurate VEX statements. You can now go ahead and combine this with your internal SBOM to produce that kind of final artifact that you would actually ship, say like an infotainment system, into a automotive manufacturer. And you're off to the races at that point. Most importantly, go ahead and pin that revision after you've combined it together, and then you can support that release kind of moving forward. So that's going to be your supplier kind of OEM relationship workflow. That's the one most mature organizations, in particular the ones who spend a lot of time on that two-way communication so they can talk back and forth. Just to kind of give a bit of a sense of what, like a bad SBOM and a good SBOM would kind of look like. You'll see a lot of red. I'm over here on that left-hand side there. We're calling out things like, oh, it's clearly missing supplier information. It's missing relationship information. It doesn't have an actual accurate vulnerability count. In this particular case, there is like a unique identifier in the case of Pearl. And so the supplier can either fix that information or you can choose to enrich that information for you. On my right-hand side, you can now see the updated version of that SBOM. And this is analysis of the SBOM, not the SBOM itself, that then has allowed for you to fill in the gaps, right? So you've added the supplier information, you've added these relationships, you've added all of your VEX assertion, and you'll even notice that you were able to dramatically reduce your vulnerability count because you got rid of false positives and duplicates. With that, I just want to kind of review some of these kind of best practices on this side, which is I can assure you do not want to do this validation manually. And so once again, there's all kinds of, free tooling out there. There's commercial tooling that you can use. Make sure that you have a really stringent conversation on what your SBOM policy is, both from a structure and then like a content or assessment perspective. Oftentimes people allow a lot of emphasis on the structure, right? Use the anti-minimum elements. Those are great, but those are insufficient. Make sure that you spend a lot of time on the assessment piece on making sure that they're not violating your open source policies internally. Find secure ways to transmit these SBOMs as well. If you're emailing your SBOMs, now I have security concerns for you, right? Like I promise you that is not the way that you want to go about doing it. Whether you're hosting your own portal and you want to distribute this along binaries that you're distributing to your customers, I think that's great. There's all kinds of tooling that you can use for, say, things like time-based access controls and have stringent RBAC if you'd like to limit the amount of time that someone has access to these things. And then finally, just make sure that you're combining your internal application data with that external data coming from the supplier, because you do want to make sure that you can pin and monitor the actual final artifact that is going to whatever your customers are using, and you don't have to then reverse engineer that information later. With that said, I tried to do it in 45 minutes was my goal. I think I'm right at time there. And so I threw a bunch at you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. If not, I'll be around a little bit after the talk. So what do we got? There we go. Question up front. What you got, my friend? Okay. Yeah, no, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have a question. You mentioned several times the fact you do this association between SBOM and PURL and CP and whatever.
Yep.
Does it mean the tools who are generate this SBOM file already include this kind of information, or is that another tool which make this association?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is not as clean, which means it depends, right? And so for package managed languages, right, if you're doing things like a Maven clean install, npm install, typically most of that tooling is going to include a package URL because I think it's kind of easy to understand. You can see that's coming from the Maven registry, coming from the npm registry, all that kind of good stuff. It becomes much more complex when you start to get into embedded systems and embedded devices. If you're using like Yocto and Buildroot and FreeRTOS and some of these other systems, it's kind of hit or miss on whether that Perl is going to be included. Oftentimes they will include a CPE. The challenge there is that CPE could be hallucinated, meaning it's not actually real or doesn't already exist on the NVD. And so you have to hope and pray that when the NVD is updated with the CPE, that it's going to match up to the one that they're hallucinating. And so it's definitely a challenge depending on what your tech stack is. And that's why it's important to put it in your policy. So that way you kind of put the burden on whoever developer is generating that to kind of combine the build tooling itself with maybe some scripting on their end where necessary to be able to fill in the gaps on that one. So yeah, it's a bit of the Wild Wild West right now. It's a great question.
Hi, Cortez. Anyway, thank you. It was a great talk. SBOMs in the real world, and I'm just curious.
Yep.
So I'm working in that space, both from a supplier, a large company with many software offerings. So both a supplier as well as a consumer. We have a rather conservative approach, right? That we are in the real world, what I find sort of fascinating is we come here and using sort of advanced tooling, it makes it sound like everybody is able to generate them easily. We know what's just production code versus dev and test. Are the people requesting them know how to consume them beyond just a procurement exercise? But I'm just curious if you have any stats too, like, so for one, I mean, we obviously will have a difference of opinion, but we're very hesitant, or shall I say, before we generate an SBOM and send it out to a client, we are working carefully with the development teams to remediate and make sure, because that SBOM leaves nowhere to hide, right?
Yes.
On the quality of your code, potentially the vulnerabilities, our legal team is all over that stuff. Like, no way are we going to disclose this stuff until it's fixed. And then I'm just curious if you know from the other side, like, I would say 80% of what I send out,
Yep.
people have no idea what to do with it.
Yes.
I mean, and granted, if they're working with an awesome platform tool like FOSSA, that's a different matter. But
Yep.
but I'm finding most people, I'd say 80% of the people we're working with have no idea what it is. And then I get the question back, wait, I thought it was going to be a human readable file, right? So I'm just curious, some of your thoughts on that real world angle. Maybe I'm too simple in the world, but that's the world we're living in, right? Super challenging that way.
No, I actually echo a lot of your sentiments. It's actually interesting too, because I'll decouple customers versus government organizations. You know, you would think that if the FDA put a mandate out that they have to supply SBOMs, that they had a plan to do something with them. Fun fact, they do not. Maybe they have a plan coming up. I apologize if any of my FDA friends are on the call. But at least initially, it's kind of a, check the block. We want to make sure we have these SBOMs so we can reference them later. And in my ideal world, they would be immediately importing those into some tool, because that's the only way you start to actually reap the value. Now, my understanding is I think they're working on building something now, and so that maturity level is starting to get there. But you're 100% spot on that. I'd say if I were to put a statistic out there, 90% of organizations do not have a means today to actually import SBOMs and monitor them on a regular basis. And I find that to be like a pretty critical flaw, because the reality is the burden that you put, and particularly if you're like an OEM putting this burden on your supplier to generate high quality SBOMs, alluding to that legal review process that you asserted earlier, ensuring that all of your vulnerabilities have some type of VEX attestation associated with it. That is intensive. That is extremely resource intensive. And I feel that we are actually doing a disservice to the industry by not then actually trying to reap the benefits of all that upfront work. I would actually go as far to say that if organizations do not intend to import an SBOM and actually do something with it, then they should not ask for them in the first place. And that may be an unpopular opinion. And so 100%, that's what I'm seeing out there in the industry. But that 10% is growing. I would say that was probably 1% a year ago, right? And so now we're at 10% of organizations that can actually do something with this. And so I think we are starting to reach the point where both sides have to meet in the middle. Those who are producing SBOMs have to become more comfortable with being a little bit more transparent, right? You didn't necessarily say this explicitly, but reading through the lines a little bit, oftentimes you see organizations that are afraid to put out an SBOM until they've, 100% triaged it. The reality is new vulnerabilities are going to keep coming out. You're probably going to miss stuff. And so you're better off being able to have that continuous communication rather than holding back your SBOM until it's kind of reached that complete point. And then I think consumers of SBOM have a lot of work to do, frankly, to be able to figure out how they're actually going to feed those into their, broader vulnerability management program. So hopefully a year from now, that position will change.
Absolutely brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I work on the vulnerability metadata side of the house. So,
nice.
And I'm an experiential learner. So I've gotten SBOMs in the abstract, but stuff like this is really helpful for people like me to be able to get a bit more concrete understanding.
Absolutely.
I feel like we're at the very beginning of the SBOM maturity adoption uptake sort of start. Yeah, we're still having these conversations around vendors being very nervous about providing an SBOM and about it being kind of the secret sauce to a degree, or just not something that they're necessarily proud of, right? Like we've got to get to that point of you pick up a bottle of ketchup, you know what's in it, right? Like that's very normalized, right? The Biden executive order around supply chain security was part of what's putting momentum behind that. Is that likely to then derail under a new administration, do you think? Or
Yeah.
can we maintain momentum to avoid a regression?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, and I love this question. I'll kind of give you a few thoughts on it. First and foremost, my strong opinion is that the cat's out the bag now, and I think it's going to be really difficult to rein that back in. And I'll tell you why I share that opinion. Because SBOMs are so interesting to me because I truly view them as a vehicle, right? Similar on the investment side, whether you want to put your investment in your 401k, your Roth IRA, a personal account, these are all various vehicles for you to make money. And I view SBOMs as essentially various vehicles for you to communicate software supply chain risk. Now, before the executive order, most of us were actually already doing SBOMs. We called them Excel sheets. And so it's not actually, that necessarily new or novel of a concept as much as it is just putting it into a structured format that is, machine readable, so that way we can kind of deal with these things better at scale in a way that CSVs, immediately fall over. And so that's the thing that makes me excited, because I think that it has become clear for any modern organization that this black box is no longer acceptable. It cannot be acceptable that I just have no idea what my suppliers are using. And so whether I make them fill out a form, which is what a lot of people are doing, whether I make them submit an Excel sheet or they submit a Cyclone DX SBOM, I think this momentum around that transparency piece is kind of too far, regardless of what the administrations say. Now, with that said, I do suspect that the push will now need to come from the commercial side of the house and not from the government side of the house in the same ways that it was before. I can see that push beginning to slow down under the new administration. And so I think it's even more critical now for all of us in this kind of community to recognize that the more transparent we are, the better the whole industry will be.
Thank you. Is this on? I guess so. All right.
Stay with your chest.
All right. My question was, can you talk about some strategies of generating SBOMs at build time, like in the pipeline? And, like, what are the approaches of doing it?
Yes, that is a great question. So I'm a big fan of generating SBOMs during build time. The reason being is because source SBOMs are oftentimes wildly insufficient, right? And so you'll see a lot of out there where you'll take like a pom.xml file or like a package JSON. You'll say, okay, great. I see that these, 10 dependencies are being asserted here. And so this is my full dependency graph. That is not your full dependency graph. That is probably the tip of the iceberg, right? And so by doing it at build time, after you've done your npm install, your maven install, whatever it is, you've done your Yocto build, you've done your build root build, you now have as close as possible to that final artifact. And the biggest benefit for me is the dependency relationships. That is one of the least appreciated aspects of the SBOM, is having full dependency graph that has, for this dependency A that brings in B, that brings in C, that brings in D, I need to be able to go through that chain. In particular, because if I want to make any impact to a transitive dependency, very, very frequently, those are actually being brought in by multiple direct dependencies. And so you will reach a false level of security if you only have the one dependency graph, if you will. And because you're going to think, great, I just upgrade dependency A, and that will help me remediate vulnerability in dependency D. But the reality is dependency D is also being brought in by dependency F. And so you have to upgrade a combination of A and F in this hypothetical scenario in order to kind of reach that point. I think from a strategy perspective, speed is going to be the name of the game, because if you are doing something in CI, the biggest fear that you're going to have there is that you fail a build for something that has nothing to do with the developer's problems, right? I think like, oh God, you got this, shitty CLI tool in here and it's just making my life worse. What do I do about that? And so I think there's ways that I would actually encourage, and what we encourage our customer base to do, is to have almost two pipelines, right? So you have your build system that kicks off your CI/CD deployment. Separately to that, you can then run your scan with whatever your SCA tooling is, because that process can be a little bit more strenuous. In particular, if you're doing like binary decomposition, which can be a multi-hour process depending on how complicated your binary is. So don't block your builds based off of your SBOM generation. Have those builds go through, kick off the SBOM generation right after that build time, have that process go through whatever efforts that it needs. And then most importantly, make sure that you're doing it for all of the tooling that's being captured there. I think that's the last piece that is oftentimes missed, which is if I have a JavaScript app, a Java app. I got, something that I'm then combining on a container for a Linux ecosystem. I want to scan on the container side of that, so that way I get both the JavaScript, the Java, and the Linux dependencies all in one SBOM. And I may have to do that in chunks in order to combine it together if I don't have tooling that covers all those languages at the same time. So that's going to be the biggest challenge that you run into, but I absolutely advocate for build time. I think it's better than runtime. Once again, going back to the relationships, you cannot get accurate relationships. And if someone says they can get accurate relationships in runtime, they are lying to you. They can make some guesses at best, but you cannot get that 100%. So I think we had one more question up this way, or oh, perfect.
Yeah, thank you for the talk also. So my question goes into the direction of kind of, you show that now with kind of a source code based approach, kind of with Canoe as a framework and kind of a developer portal frameworks like Backstage, where this is kind of open source frameworks for developer portals that are kind of closed in itself. So basically you do during build time, the SBOM generation, you kind of have everything mapped together.
Yep.
But kind of from your perspective, what is it, or what can we do in order to basically bridge that gap between the source code generation of all that data and the runtime operations of that data? Kind of the CVE framework now has this 4222, you should have vulnerabilities on cloud. So how do we bridge the gap and enable, for example, scanner vendors to leverage that information?
Yep. No, this is a great question. I absolutely love this one. I have an opinion on what I think the answer is. I don't know if this is the correct one or not, but in my ideal world, you would actually be required to generate an SBOM at every stage of the SDLC. And so you would do it at source, you would do it at build, you would do it at runtime, and then, you do it at deploy time, and then you would do it at runtime. And then what you would do is you would do a diff across all four of those. So that way you can see at what point in my SDLC did a particular package get introduced. You would then tag that with a package label, or CycloneDX has support for tags. And then you would then ingest all of that into whatever your tooling is and be able to resurface that. Are we there today? I don't think so. I think most people are kind of just choosing the one place that is going to be most accurately represent. But I actually think it's a huge gap because the problem is you can know what's in your SBOM if you're only scanning it at build time, which is what I'm recommending. What you may struggle with is figuring out, well, where was that introduced? In particular, most people have multi-stage builds now, and so that becomes even more complicated on where is this particular dependency actually coming from, and how do I then figure out which one of my 100 different repos do I need to go back to remediate that. So truthfully, I don't have the greatest answer for you right now at this moment, as much as it is that in my ideal world, I think we would be required to scan at every stage. And if you have a mature enough organization where you're comfortable doing that, then I would actually recommend that you generate that SBOM at source, you do it at build time, you then compare that to the version of it at runtime, and then you kind of walk your way back into figuring out, okay, well, this dependency didn't exist at source, so it must have been introduced during build time. So, but that's I want to chat more about that one because that's a hard problem to solve. So,
Cortez, we're at time, so we will direct audience members. Find Cortez when you can.
Yep.
And hit him up with your questions. And Cortez, if you wouldn't mind just taking a look at Discord when you get a chance. And thank you for your time. Round of applause for Cortez.
Yep. Thank you so much, everyone. You've been absolutely fantastic. I'll be hanging out at the FOSSA booth in the vendor room. So if you have any more questions, just meet me over there.